Hi, everybody. So this is chapter 11 for Bio 101, and this is going to be the chapter about natural selection. So natural selection, we're going to look at it in terms of bacteria, because this is microevolution, the stuff that we can see on shorter terms. And then that allows us to look at um, some of the examples of evolution. So, uh, you know, of all the things in this book, I have a hard time with their story that they propose at the beginning. It feels a little xenophobic to me. As a microbiologist, I think we could come up with a whole lot more um, observations of antibiotic resistant bacteria in our day-to-day lives. Uh, there's vancomycin resistant enterococci, there's methicillin resistant Staphylococcus aureus, uh, Corynebacterium or Clostridium species are resistant. So it didn't really need to, I think, focus on foreigners. Um, Also, I need to tell you at this point, um, we're talking about bacteria. And I know that we're talking or that we're living in a global pandemic right now with viral infections, and there's these new strains of the coronavirus that keep cropping up. But viruses are not alive, so they don't evolve in the way that we're talking about when it comes to evolution. So we have to talk about examples of bacteria if we're going to talk about this microevolution. So this is the bacteria that we're going to talk about. It's Mycobacterium tuberculosis, and it's the bacterium that causes tuberculosis, which is this lung infection. This particular genus, so other Mycobacterium species and other genera that are similar to them, can also cause diseases like leprosy. But tuberculosis has been around for, I don't, forever. Tuberculosis is called consumption a lot of times because um, it resides in the lungs, and it is very difficult for the body to recognize this particular type of bacterium because that has a very special type of cell envelope. And it's also difficult to treat with drugs and diagnose. And certainly back in the times of the Egyptians and the Hippocrates, they really didn't have the tools that we have even now, and even now it's not easy to spot. So even now, tuberculosis can cause lots of diseases or lots of incidents of disease and even some death. But before, it used to be much, much worse. So they would reside in the lung tissue and they would never go away. And so it would just eat away at the person, not eat literally, but figuratively at the person until they wasted away. So it's called consumption because it consumes you. Certainly, there would be coughing that produces blood as the microbe destroys the lung tissue, but fever is going to result from the body's feeble attempts to fix it, to eradicate that microbe. We're going to learn about fever later. And fatigue, not only from trying to fight the microbe, but also from lack of oxygen. And eventually, lots of people just waste away. So it was also called the wasting disease, consumption or the wasting disease. Tuberculosis, because it is a lung disease, it's transferred through aerosols and droplets. So yeah, they've got a sneeze here, but people would cough, and coughing is definitely a way to spread aerosols. But even just speaking is going to spread aerosols. It still happens. So certainly people who are immunocompromised are going to be at risk of tuberculosis. Um, I've been here. This is a sanatorium. Of course, it didn't look like that when I was there. But people really tried to combat this with these sanatoriums. They thought that fresh air would work, and it does, because the air would dilute the aerosol droplets and prevent person-to-person transfer. Of course, it's not going to make the individual who is infected any better. Antibiotics are the treatment for tuberculosis. And even then, because they've got that special cell envelope, they're a little bit harder to treat than say Escherichia coli or E. coli, as you might know it. And you have to continue to treat for a very, very long time. This guy is slow growing, and so he's also slow dying, and he's a tricky one. But antibiotics aren't really the cure-all that they originally were thought to be. In fact, so Alexander Fleming discovered when he came back from vacation that the bacteria on his petri dish weren't growing up around this mold. And this mold is bread mold, it's Penicillium notatum. And he spent a really long time proving that the penicillin, the mold, was producing something that killed the staph, the bacterium. But that didn't go very far because, it costs a lot of money. And then what do you do with that? Great, you proved it. But that was right around the time of World War II. And what people often don't talk about is one of the biggest killers of soldiers was venereal disease, sex-acquired infections. And they were caused by bacteria called Neisseria gonorrhea and Treponema pallidum, which causes syphilis. The first one causes gonorrhea and the second one causes syphilis. And so those bacteria could be given this penicillin and it would kill the bacteria. And so this drug was bought up by some guys, and it was further developed into a high throughput way of manufacturing penicillin. And then it was widely advertised as the silver bullet, the magic cure-all drug. You can get over gonorrhea in just 4 hours, which this is all incorrect. And in fact, gonorrhea, the bacterium that causes gonorrhea, it's called Neisseria gonorrhea, which was the first microbe to become resistant to drugs too. And so we have a lot of antibiotic resistant drugs. And in this case, a lot of people who are dying from tuberculosis are dying from the antibiotics resistant ones, because you can't give them the drug and then just kill the bacteria. So how do these microbes become resistant to the drugs? Well, it's through the process of natural selection. Natural selection, I mentioned in the last chapter, I explained it just a little bit as how we end up with such species diversity on Earth. So natural selection is these populations of bacteria are going to have some variation in their genes that cause some ever so slight variations in their phenotype, the way they look or their ability to do something. And those variations are going to make that microbe more resistant to the drug. So what happens is, let me click on the next slide because it has point by point. What happens is when that drug is applied to the microbes, the ones that don't have that variation are killed, but the ones that do remain, and then they're able to divide by binary fission and repopulate. And now everybody in the gene pool has that variation. They are resistant. So in the cases of, Darwin's first observation, he also looked at things like beak length in finches, or beak size and shape in finches, and the ability of that bird to be able to eat a certain food source, a certain type of seed. And so if that bird was able to eat that seed, it would be better fed, it would be more likely to survive, it would be more likely to lay eggs or fertilize eggs and have offspring that also have that beak length. Some of these changes are things like coat color, bloom times. So here, if you think about it, these variations are they're random, right? So like just different wolves, the couple flowers here are blooming at different times. But if that particular variation improves that ability of that organism to pass on their genes to the offspring, then that's the process of natural selection. That's where now that offspring is going to have those genes and the population is going to start to drift in that direction. So some of the terms when we're talking about the ability to reproduce and pass on those genes, we're talking about fitness. So we're talking about that relative survival and reproduction of that individual against the population. And then the population is going to all gain that individual trait. Oh, here, so there we go. Birds with larger bills could crack open tough seeds and were more fit during drought conditions. So an adaptation for survival, flowers, bright colors attract pollinators. And so Darwin proposed the cause of evolution was natural selection. And how do you test that? Well, you can do artificial selection in the lab, you can do natural selection in the lab, and then you can look at natural selection in wild populations. So artificial selection, this is not natural, right? This is artificial. This is us making dogs. This is us making, certain foods, or certain plants that are more beautiful, or flowers, or that will produce a chemical that we can use for dyes or things like that. So this is unrelated to fitness. Artificial selection is just artificial. It's just based on some other goal. Now, natural selection isn't based on a goal, right? It's just a thing that happens that we can observe that makes something more fit, and then they can pass on their genes. We can kind of apply natural selection in small populations, and we can see it happening. And then we can look at natural selection in larger populations. Oh, so here's one, which is an artificial selection example. Breeding, good. So beetles acquired immunity. This is going to be natural. This one is natural, and resistance of HIV to antiviral drugs. This is not what we call evolution in any way. It's a different term when we're talking about viruses because they're not alive. They don't reproduce in the way that we talk about reproduction. Okay, natural selection since Darwin. There's some new theories, and I've been talking a lot about genes too. And so when we think about it, it's, you've got genes in a population. Some of those are going to have some random differences, and then when you apply that selective pressure, then those particular alleles of those genes get passed on. So there's some limitations. Looks like I got a table coming up, so I'll just go through them this way. Natural selection doesn't think. So it's not, it's not like a decision of a particular individual to adapt and then somehow become more fit. Um, it's not possible um, to think your way into being more fit in a particular situation because it's genetic. And again, if they're not well adapted, then somehow, it wouldn't, fitness isn't always that particular, it's not always perfect. So sometimes we have adaptations or we do things and it's unrelated to fitness. Um, and yeah, chimpanzees did evolve. They evolved differently than we did. There is no end goal to natural selection. So nothing is trying to be more like humans. What does survival of the fittest really mean? Yeah, here's one for you. I'll give you a couple seconds. What does survival of the fittest really mean? Good. Yeah, it's the one that is best adapted or most fit. And so these ones actually are kind of the other foils are based on the common misconceptions. Okay, little subtleties of natural selection. Only traits that are in the population can be acted on. So, if you have a recessive allele and it's not being expressed, it's possible that that is unaffected by natural selection. I'm just trying to think of an example. One adaptation uh, that would make you more fit might also make you less fit in another situation. So the results of whether or not an organism is fit is based on the current environment. Yeah, natural selection can't cause new traits. New traits come from mutations. Um, so something that was already there or that mutated to become there. Organisms do not become a better fit to their environment. Yeah, they're fit for certain situations. Uh, a beneficial adaptation in one might be a liability in another. And there is no goal to natural selection. It's unthinking and unfeeling. Patterns of selection. So again, there is no goal. So we actually have to broaden our thought about natural selection and think about there's a few different ways that natural selection can work. Directional selection is going to mean that the population drifts and eventually, the majority of the population has one particular trait. But you can also have stabilizing where you increase the major or you reduce diversity in that particular population. So the outliers drop off. So I guess I don't know, in the case of birds, maybe like plumage color could be a stabilizing thing. I'm just coming up with examples. Don't hold me to this, but like having a wide different color of feathers. The really bright ones are going to get picked up by predators and the really dark ones are going to show up in snow. So if you're kind of brown and boring, you're right in the middle. And so natural selection might cause your population to end up being almost all just brown and boring. And then you can have diversifying selection where you start drifting towards the extremes. And I can't come up with an example on the spot for that one. All right, so this one would be the diversifying one. Wow, it's not a good review question when it's right afterwards. Okay, natural selections in humans. So let's go back to tuberculosis and Darwin. So again, with the bacteria, there were some that were slightly more resistant, and when you apply the antibiotic, the susceptible, weaker bacteria, for lack of a better term, they're called susceptible, are destroyed. And the ones that are more fit, that have that little bit extra resistance, remain. And when you remove that selective pressure of antibiotics, those bacteria that remain can then reproduce. And now you end up with an entire population that is more likely to survive. That's directional natural selection. So what do you think? Is it okay to stop taking your antibiotics if you feel better before the prescription's gone? This is patently false. This is absolutely false. And let me also just say a few other things. As a microbiologist, um, we are causing a lot of these antibiotic resistant strains by doing stuff like this, by getting a prescription for antibiotics and not finishing it, but also by asking for a prescription of antibiotics for viral infections, because viruses are not bacteria. And so you can't treat a viral infection with antibiotics. And then what happens is you apply that antibiotic to all the resident flora in your body, and you apply this unnecessary selective pressure on those bacteria and it doesn't affect your cold anyway. There are very narrow spectrum drugs that are meant to target only certain pathogens or certain groups of pathogens when it comes to bacteria, versus broad spectrum, which is what they call a shotgun approach. Just kill all the bacteria. And again, if you want to target just what is infecting you, that's better than applying the shotgun approach to all the bacteria in your body. And then of course, don't take other people's antibiotics and things like that. But those two big ones: finish your drugs, don't ask for antibiotic if you've got a viral infection. I guess there's a third one, and get a narrow spectrum drug if you can. And if it's a really bad infection, you need culture sensitivity and diagnostic testing. You need to know what it is so you can get the exact drug or the exact combination of drugs. Because now we're at the point where one particular drug doesn't always work. So now what we have to do is we have to do what's called combination drug therapy, where we apply this drug and then whoever was resistant to those, stay. So then we have to apply another drug. And if we do them all at the same time, then we don't allow that resistant population to come back. So combination drug therapy, this is last ditch effort stuff, right? So ideally, if you have a really bad infection, you do culture sensitivity and diagnostic testing, which means they're going to find out what drug works best for you for killing that particular organism and at what concentration. Because this is how all kinds of, I don't know why the authors think they need to bold scientific names. We italicize Latin names, not bold them. But MRSA, methicillin-resistant Staphylococcus aureus, that causes staph infections, has become resistant to methicillin, which is an antibiotic. Vancomycin is one of our last ditch effort antibiotics. And there are even Enterococcus species which are resistant to vancomycin. These guys cause unbelievable intestinal issues: diarrhea, pain, loss of weight. They're really bad. They're called superbugs because they are super resistant. And so the question is, can humans evolve to be resistant to this bacterium? No, you can't. And the reason why we can't is because they're evolving on a much faster rate than we are. And so, what we would have to do is we would have to have a whole bunch of people. What traits would happen? We'd have to have a whole bunch of people who are infected with tuberculosis and survive, and only those people were allowed to reproduce. And everybody else would be dead anyway, so they wouldn't be able to reproduce. This just unimaginable for us to do that. many humans would need to die for us to be resistant. Okay, I don't know what's going on with my computer, but that was the end. Oh, no, it's not. It was not the end. We're almost to the end. We're going to show you this, and then we're going to say, here are the learning outcomes. And I hope you can speak to all those things. And if you want to talk more microbiology with me, I could talk about it all day, all week. So feel free to send me your questions in the chat. All right, this is the end.